This is the first video in a series on literary theory. Each video will look at a different theoretical approach to literary texts, and with this one we'll start on formalism. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the major characters, different groups associated with formalist literary criticism. We'll start with a group called the New Critics. There were two groups. There was a group in England, and we'll start with them, and then a couple of prominent American literary critics who are associated with this movement, the New Criticism. We'll start with the English literary critics. T.S. Eliot, who edited an important literary magazine in the 1920s and 30s called The Criterion, and this magazine published poetry, stories, literary criticism. Some of Eliot's own literary criticism appeared in The Criterion. T.S. Eliot is known for primarily for these essays. These are his major pieces of literary criticism. He has many more than this, but these are the big ones. Tradition and the Individual Talent in 1917, Hamlet and His Problems in 1919, The Function of Criticism in 1923, and The Frontiers of Criticism in 1956. And the first three of these appeared in his book Selected Essays, which came out first. It came out in 1932, and then he republished it, I believe, in 1951 with some additional essays. We're looking at the cover of that later 1951 edition here. And then towards the end of his career, he gave a lecture that became the essay, The Frontiers of Criticism. And these are his four major pieces. These are the ones I would say students who are interested in formalist literary criticism, these would be the four major pieces. Another character is I.A. Richards, and he wrote two important books that espouse formalist ideas, Principles of Literary Criticism in 1924 and Practical Criticism in 1929. And then the last of the English group would be William Empson, whose most famous book was 7 Types of Ambiguity in 1930. And that term, ambiguity, is an important one for formalist critics. They like things to be difficult. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So on this side of the Atlantic, we have a couple of major characters in the formalist school. The first one would be Cleanth Brooks, whose most famous book was published in 1947 called The Well-Wrought Urn, which contains different essays, different formalist readings of famous poems, such as Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, for example. He also collaborated with another American critic, also a poet and novelist, Robert Penn Warren, and they collaborated on several books that became foundational for the way literature was taught in the 20th century in America. An Approach to Literature, 1938, Understanding Poetry, 1939, and Understanding Fiction, 1943. So in addition to the so-called New Critics, another school of formalism would be the Russian formalists, and there are two figures in this group that loom pretty large. The first would be Viktor Shklovsky, who wrote an essay called Art as Technique, and then his important book, A Theory of Prose. And he is responsible for this idea of the concept of defamiliarization. Now, that's an English translation of a Russian word, and we'll talk more about defamiliarization in just a moment. And finally, there is Mikhail Bakhtin. And Bakhtin is famous for, he wrote a number of important books, but his most famous ones would be Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics, where he talks a lot about his he uses his theoretical concepts, applies them to Dostoevsky. And Dostoevsky, from his point of view, is the supreme novelist, the novelist of all novelists. In 1965, he published a book that was originally intended to be his doctoral work, his doctoral thesis. He'd been working on it for decades, called Rabelais and His World. It's about the French satirist Rabelais. And then he published a number of essays between 1937 and 41. There are 4 of them. And they came out, they were translated into English in the 1960s, I think, and they were published as The Dialogic Imagination. And for American readers, this would be the starting place, I think. Starting with The Dialogic Imagination is a really good introduction to Bakhtin's theories of the novel. So one aspect of this video series will be to give you some background about some of the major critics who were considered foundational in developing these theories, and also to spend some time talking about major concepts and some of the vocabulary that is introduced in the chapter that goes with each of these theories. So we'll start, obviously, with formalism. And I'll start with just some basic principles. We'll talk through some of the basic principles of formalist literary criticism. It's centered on the text. It's deeply concerned with the structure and form of a literary work. It's concerned with language and meaning and unity and tension. We'll talk about each of these things in a moment. The big idea, though, is that it's really a very text-centered literary theory. It emphasizes close reading of the work itself. It does not look outside the text for meaning. So it doesn't treat the text as an expression of social, religious, or political ideas. It doesn't even get into biographical detail, not interested in details of the writer's life or how the writer's society or the historical conditions in which he or she lived impacted the creation of the work. All of that is deemed completely irrelevant to how the text achieves meaning. The critic avoids what the new critics called the intentional fallacy, or trying to grasp what the author originally intended in writing the work. They're not interested in intentions. They believe everything is contained in the work itself. And they also avoid something called the affective fallacy, which is shifting the focus away from the text itself to the impression that it makes on the reader or on the critic or on the writer's audience. So, in short, understanding a literary work comes from looking at the work itself and eliminating everything outside of the work, including the writer himself or herself. So it looks at the literary text as a completely self-sufficient object with formal elements and laws of its own that can be studied, identified and studied. So some of those laws are concerned with structure and form. So a formalist reading will examine the form of a literary text. It identifies the different parts and tries to understand how they work together to produce meaning. Does the text follow the conventions or rules associated with a particular genre, like the epic or the sonnet, or classical tragedy? Are there patterns or repetitions or parallelisms within the text? So looking at themes, figurative language, other literary devices, that's what close reading is trying to identify. So language and meaning. The formalist critics pay close attention to language, diction, and the meanings of words, particularly when meanings seem to be in play, when they get, we might say, when meanings get a little slippery. So in addition to denotative meanings, these dictionary definitions of words, they're even more interested in connotative meanings, meanings of words that develop internally within the text. Sort of unique to the linguistic environment of the text that's being studied. And those meanings develop internally and add complexity and nuance to the literary text. And finally, unity and tension. Ultimately, the formalist critic is trying to understand the work as a unified whole. But the flip side of that is they don't want it to come too easily. They're literary critics after all. So they value complicated texts that are very challenging to the reader. So they're really interested in things like irony, paradox, slippery meanings, contradictions, ambiguity, and uncertainty. In short, they're interested in identifying elusive patterns and meanings that tend to destabilize the text and make it difficult and require the knowledge and intense scrutiny of the literary critic to make sense of it. With the Russian formalists, we get a whole different set of concepts to consider. I'm going to list them out. First, defamiliarization. Again, this is primarily associated with the Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky. Dialogism. Unfinalizability. That's a mouthful of syllables. Heteroglossia. Polyphony. And the carnivalesque. So we'll talk about each of these concepts, and one of the challenges of these concepts is a lot of them overlap with each other. But we'll start with defamiliarization. This is Shklovsky's concept. This refers to language that is surprising, unusual, challenging. As readers, we experience pleasure whenever we encounter something new. We pay closer attention to texts that break from everyday usage and conventional forms. It might be, for example, a really bizarre image or metaphor that makes you pause, like Dickinson's "My Life Has Stood a Loaded Gun," or the complicated plot of a story like "A Rose for Emily" that rearranges the elements of the story in a way that challenges our understanding and expectations. And for Shklovsky, this is what makes literature literature, this concept of defamiliarization, taking everyday uses of language and transforming them in novel ways. So the remaining 5 terms listed here are from Bakhtin's theoretical work, and one of the fundamental ones is this concept of dialogism, and this is the idea that meaning is social. That meaning is the product of an interaction between at least 2 people, or between the text and the reader, or between characters interacting in a story. So meaning is always a creation of 2 parties, and therefore it's never completely stable. It's always in process. Meaning is always being made. And that is slightly different from the way that the Western new critics thought about texts. So related to this concept of dialogism is unfinalizability. The dialogic nature of meaning requires us to accept that meaning is always in the process of becoming. It is never final. So we must seek to understand how meaning is produced in a literary text and how it is shaped by other texts, and even by readers themselves. Of course, the American and British new critics would call that the affective fallacy, how readers shape the meaning of a text. Heteroglossia. This refers to the variety of discourses available to the people of a given community or culture, based on factors such as profession, gender, economic class, education, ethnicity, and so forth. Bakhtin prefers the novel to poetry. He sees poetry as monologic because it forces everything into a single form or statement that comes from one authority, the poet. The novel, by contrast, or at least the ideal novel from Bakhtin's point of view, allows for a diversity of voices to interact in an ongoing production of meaning, which again is what he meant by dialogism. You might think about the different ways that you use language based on your context. The way you use language when you're writing a paper versus the language you use when you're texting a friend or a family member, or the language you use when you're texting a specific family member versus when you're texting a friend. That as we move through the day, as we move through our jobs, as we move through school, as we move through our private lives, we engage in different forms of discourse depending on our audience. And that is the heteroglossic nature of discourse that Bakhtin is particularly interested in. And he sees the novel as a particularly effective medium for conveying the heteroglossic nature of language. Related to this idea of heteroglossia is polyphony. So in his ideal heteroglossic novel, and again, the Russian novelist Dostoevsky is his sort of ideal novelist, the writer of the Karamazov brothers, Crime and Punishment. There is no authorial governance in the ideal heteroglossic novel. There's no narrator that shapes meaning or over-determines the meaning of the novel. So there's no conclusion or closure. There's only in polyphony, there's only the jostling of these different discourses. Truth is perceived through multiple consciousnesses, not just one consciousness. And it's expressed in many simultaneous voices, not just one voice. Its meaning is not conceived in a single mind or spoken by a single speaker. So there is no centralized voice, just multiple unfinalizable characters that talk about ideas in their distinctive and individual ways. And polyphony is the term he uses to describe this open-endedness. And finally, we need to talk about the carnivalesque. It's kind of this, the carnivalesque is the boy, that's a hard word for me to say all of a sudden, politicization of the concepts that we've just been talking about. And he formulates this mostly in his work on the French satirist Rabelais. So Bakhtin recognized in his theoretical writings the radical implications of polyphony. So to the degree that heteroglossic texts, polyphonic texts, disrupt monologic discourse, and monologic discourse for Bakhtin is associated with institutions that are charged with maintaining social order. In order to have social order, you've got to have rules that everyone follows and that meanings and rules that are universal. And the polyphonic novel, heteroglossic texts, challenge mechanisms of power by subverting or destroying the notion of regular conventions, standardization, rules. And the polyphonic novel suggests a kind of freedom of being. It turns society inside out, which is the essence of the idea of what he calls the carnival. So he's not just thinking about carnival in terms of an event, but as a way of thinking about discourse and thinking about the world, a subversive way of thinking about discourse. Discourse that overturns monologic ideas. So these are revolutionary ideas here. Okay. That concludes this first video on formalism.